Okay, great. All right, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Q, and I'm a data analyst for the University of Toronto's School of Cities. Recently, we released a study on the traffic violations of the King Street Transit Priority Corridor, and that got a little bit of news attention. Especially interesting after the other news article on the King Street streetcar getting ticketed last month. So I'm not sure how I feel about following up on that, but here we are. So I'm here today to talk to you about a little bit about the analysis that was done for our study, as well as clarifying some background information and then just opening up space for discussion. And here's us. So here's me on the left and Jeff on the right. Jeff is my co-author for the study. He is the data viz lead at the School of Cities. He planned and wrote most of the article and also made the counter that you guys really liked in the corner of the webpage. But yeah, at the School of Cities, we look into different important urban issues, and the King Street Transit Priority Corridor was just one of them. Please check out the School of Cities website for other articles. And like I said earlier, I'll be going over the article, looking at the analysis, providing some background information, and I'll also be introducing some new numbers that we didn't have room for in the article. So that was specifically for traffic violations, eastbound versus westbound direction for 2019. So nothing mind-blowing, but something interesting to think about and possibly discuss. And then, of course, we'll have the Q&A at the end. So I'll jump right in, taking this chart from the article. This is the average violations per day for each intersection for 2019. And this one we had some of our biggest hits for. We found that on average, there were 6,873 traffic violations per day across the entire corridor, which is a really big number. And you can see the breakdown here in the chart. When we focused on the data for 2019 because it was the only year of continuous data collection since the King Street pilot started in 2017, and also before some of the data collection sensors were decommissioned in 2020. And this was also, of course, before COVID hit and the lockdowns affected traffic volumes in 2020. So specifically, I believe it's also noted in the article that the intersections that were decommissioned in 2020 were Portland, Peter, John, Simcoe, York, and Church. I think that's all. So for 2019, however, we have essentially data for almost all of the intersections. The traffic violations are derived from traffic volume data provided by the City of Toronto. And that data set had traffic volumes for through movements, left turn movements, and right turn movements for both eastbound and westbound traffic at these intersections. So the violations are essentially the traffic volumes for restricted movements. So the movements that you're not permitted to make an intersection are the violations. In this chart, though, you can see there are more violations at the intersections on the west side of the transit priority corridor. So Bathurst, Portland, Spadina, and Peter have more traffic violations. And you'll also note that intersections like John, Simcoe, York, and Bay have very few violations compared to the others. So that's John, Simcoe, York, and Bay. And this is because the intersections have different restricted movements. And we'll see that in the next slide here. So this slide has an adapted map of the traffic movement restrictions in the corridor. And you'll see that the intersections with the red bar, like this, are intersections with no through movements and no left turns. But you'll also find that some intersections don't have this red bar. So specifically, as previously mentioned, John, Simcoe, York, and Bay. So these intersections permit through movements, and through movements take up the bulk of all traffic violations, and that's why their traffic violations are really low. So if I go back a slide, you'll see John, Simcoe, York, and Bay. These guys are really low because they're only, this number only includes left turn violations. Yeah. Yeah, and actually for Simcoe, I'll clarify, for Simcoe has no violations in the chart slide, because Simcoe doesn't have any data. Simcoe's data was only collected for a brief period before the pilot started in 2017, and then it just did not collect data at all. Yeah. And for our analysis, we limited traffic violations to, of course, the restricted movements at these intersections, but also those that occurred specifically between 5 a.m. and 10 p.m. As you may or may not know, on King for the corridor, between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., so late evening and early morning hours, taxis are actually permitted to go through the corridor and ignore the restrictions, presumably to pick up people who are entertaining themselves and going to parties. And so because the data doesn't differentiate between private vehicles and taxis and other types of vehicles, we decided to not include those hours for our analysis. Anyway, so I know that a lot of people enjoyed the counter on the webpage for the estimated number of cars that have violated the traffic restrictions since opening the webpage. So this was actually Jeff's creation, and it's quite mind-boggling how quickly it goes up. But essentially, if you've timed it, you'll know that the counter goes up by one car every 9 seconds or so. This is based on that 2019 data where there were 6,873 cars violating the restrictions in the corridor, and that's about 404 per hour, or 6.7 violations per minute. So that's a car every 9 seconds. So it's quite shocking. Okay, so next we'll look at traffic tickets. So this is the other data set. In 2019, as you can see here, there were on average 17.5 traffic tickets per day across the corridor, for a total of 6,387 tickets for all 365 days of 2019. So this is quite low compared to the number of traffic violations. So a whole year's worth of traffic tickets for those restrictions are not even able to capture the average day's worth of violations. And as the article describes, this number of tickets is only 0.255% of the overall total number of violations estimated from the city's traffic volume data of 2019. So more than 99.7% of drivers are violating the traffic restrictions of the corridor, are not being fined. That these drivers are not being fined, and that's super disappointing, of course. And also, if you look at the charts, the distribution of the tickets mostly across each intersection mostly line up with the traffic volumes. Although I'm not quite sure what's happening here with Portland. Portland does have a higher number, the highest number of traffic violations though. So they're like mostly lined up. Yeah. Okay. And so here is the chart on total traffic tickets per month for all intersections from the few months or most of the year before the King Street pilot in 2017 all the way to this past May in 2023. So we have here really low numbers because there were no restrictions in place until the pilot began. And then you see lots and lots of tickets in the beginning during the pilot, and then the pilot became permanent in 2019-ish, and so there's still lots of tickets. But then 2020 hit, which included COVID, and so ticketing dropped quite dramatically and has not really recovered since. The other chart in the article shows warnings, and that was really interesting to see how the warnings were super high for the very beginning of the pilot, and then basically completely dropped off ever. We're still not quite sure why an enforcement officer would issue a ticket versus issue a warning. But yeah. Our police ticket data was obtained through a Freedom of Information request, which took about 6 months since the request to when we received the data, and also cost at least $180 for, I'm not quite sure exactly, I think it was related to processing time. And the data included all types of tickets that were issued in the King Street Transit Priority Corridor, so not just for the restrictions, for violations of the restrictions, but also like parking related things. And so we had to clean that up. But of course, we were interested in the tickets that were specifically for violating the restrictions of the corridor. And we determined those by identifying, there were two main ones: the Highway Traffic Act category 144, section 9 of proceed contrary to sign at intersection and its variations, as there were a couple, as well as Highway Traffic Act category 182, section 2, disobey sign, which is a more general category for when drivers disobey signs, including the intersection restriction signs. And then so a couple of other relevant violations were included, such as fail to obey lane sign. I checked a lot of these based off of which intersection the ticket was based on, and I would assume that is, oh, there's a car in what used to be the middle lane or like the left turning lane, but the left turning lane has been painted over with the yellow stripes to tell drivers that they're not supposed to be in that lane. But yeah. And I know in doing the research for this study was that the Toronto Police have previously said in a 2019 CBC article that the infractions at the time in 2019, the infractions were mostly incurred by drivers coming from out of town. But at this point, we're in 2023, like 4 years later, 5 years later, we don't really know where the drivers are coming from. That's not information that could be included in our Freedom of Information request. So I'm not sure what that looks like now. Yeah. Okay, and so next slide is our new numbers on something that was a personal curiosity of mine, which was for the direction of traffic violations, and also specifically looking at 2019 because that's where all the data is. And so I want to know if there were particular intersections and directions that had it really bad in terms of traffic violations. And I wanted to see if any of them stood out, because like this could potentially be like something that police enforcement could be focused on. Say, for example, if you see that there are a lot more violations on the west side of the King Street corridor, and then most of them look to be coming westbound, then that could be where they focus their enforcement on. But those are just some ideas. I'm not sure if the police has any data like this. I'm not sure if they have access to the city's data. I'm not sure what that process looks like. But our police ticket data that we had requested did not have detailed location-related attributes to really understand like which like corner of the intersection the ticket was issued at. We only knew which intersection that the ticket was closest to. Yeah, so there's a pretty big limitation there. And in this chart, you can see that there are, on the west side of the corridor, from Bathurst through Peter, there are more westbound violations, but on the east side, specifically Yonge, Church, and Jarvis, there are more eastbound violations, although the total numbers here are lower than westbound. The middle ground seems to be at around University. I'm not sure why this is, but I can imagine that this is kind of like the core of the core. But yeah, and so that's all I have to say tonight in terms of the presentation. Thank you for listening to me talk, and let's do discussion and Q&A.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So we've got plenty of time for Q&As. We'll start with folks online. If there's anyone online who has a question, please put a Q into the chat, and we'll call on folks um, in order over there. Adam, do we have any Qs? I do see one from John.
Yeah. Take John's question, and I'll get the chat back up on the screen. It sort of disappeared when they shipped to the screen. So yeah, John is the first one, and then I'm gonna put myself in the queue to go next.
Great. Okay, go for it, John.
Going for it. Have you guys done any research on what methods might actually be effective for enforcement? I mean, right now, Ontario has this weird thing where you haven't broken the traffic laws unless a police officer actually sees you doing it, which is, there are a lot of other places where, for example, the courts will accept video recordings from video recordings as evidence of law breaking, period. And a private citizen can take a video and lay in information. That's not true, and that's not true as far as I can tell in Toronto. I don't know if there's any law that says it can't happen. But I was wondering if you had any views on law enforcement, because yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, John. I know there's a lot of discussion on automated enforcement. I have been reading the Reddit threads when our article was cited and discussed by other news sources. And I think there's certainly potential for different methods for enforcement other than posting an officer on corners. And I believe the King Street Transit Priority Quarter is actually like 3 different jurisdictions. I'm not sure what the word is, but there's 3 different areas, so three different groups of police have to cover the corridor, and so they all have to work together in order to do enforcement along the corridor. I'm not sure if I would like to think that the automated enforcement is possible. We have automated speed cameras, but that's not quite the same thing in terms of like identifying cars, license plates, and drivers that are turning when they're not supposed to be, or going straight when they're not supposed to be. So I feel like there's a lot more room to discuss and research this kind of enforcement.
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
Let's take one more question online, and then we'll take questions in person.
Okay. My question is, have you looked at the pedestrian and cross street things? This is purely anecdotal on my end, but I live right near the eastern end of the so-called priority part, right? And I'm traveling in the King and Jarvis area quite a bit to do my grocery. And I find that everybody and their dog is just playing we want to get to the Jarvis Gardner ramps as quick as we can. And the intersection of King and becomes, even as a pedestrian, a constipated mess. And I don't think it just needs I think it needs one of those people with a whistle directing traffic, because there's so many times. But again, I probably need numbers and data for this argument. Am I right in saying most of your data is pre-pandemic, or is there areas where we could easily get the data in a readable form for like now?
Multi-year data pre-pandemic, I would assume that if the city has sensors at the locations of interest, then they would have, and that they're online and operating, then they would have the traffic volume data for that. I'm not sure if they would have pedestrian related data. I don't recall if that was something that they would collect in this case.
And yeah, I'll just quickly say I also volunteer with the TTC riders, and we're planning to do an action either in December or early January along the priority route, just because it is such a mess, and rather than let it die, TTC Riders wants to save it and sort of make it as good as it was in that first little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be nice if it could be as good as it was during the pilot.
Thanks. We've got a bunch of questions in the room.
Hey, this is James. Just was wondering that the violations that you were tracking were specifically for violating, like going through, rather than like speeding or red light infractions, or other than that, any other infractions like that.
Yes, you're speaking of the tickets?
Yeah, the tickets. Yeah.
Yes, for the tickets, we specifically looked at proceed, what did I say? Proceed contrary to sign at intersection. So specifically ignoring the sign saying you can't go through and you can't turn left, or just the general one, disobey sign. I don't know why sometimes the officer would check off disobey sign for a ticket or a warning, but sometimes they use that in order to include those signs as well. So no speeding, no running reds, no.
This is Gabe. What about a situation where you had like a southbound car on one of the on some like Bathurst or Portland, and they if the traffic was really busy, they would end up stuck in the intersection, say on the eastbound side, blocking traffic once the light had turned. Does that count in your traffic violation count? Like I asked because, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Southbound car on Bathurst trying to turn to go east?
They go straight on southbound on Bathurst, but then they get stuck in the intersection because they because there's too much traffic and they didn't make it across, basically. Would that count as an eastbound violation?
If
you're going southbound and you get stuck in the intersection, presumably you're blocking the eastbound traffic.
But so it wouldn't be a violation of those particular traffic laws?
Violation of the King Street, like I guess the priority laws. But I asked because there was analysis by Steve Monroe today, and he identified this behavior or these violations as a specific reason why there's a lot more eastbound delays on the streetcars than there are westbound delays. And that's sort of contrary to like the 2019, those counts you were showing. So I'm interested in whether you're taking that into account.
Okay. So the restrictions in the corridor only affect traffic trying to enter the corridor or go through the corridor. So if you look at the restrictions map, you'll see that, for example, at Bathurst, if you're going north or south, there are no restrictions. There are only restrictions if you are on King, and you're not allowed to go through on King, and you're not allowed to turn left off of King.
Okay.
Going.
Yeah, I think I understand. I was just saying that that's a violation, I guess, in the intersection of the corridor, but that wouldn't be tracked by you, but nevertheless has like a big effect on transit times. I guess that's what I'm trying to.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. For sure it would affect the streetcar transit times.
We've got another question online from Douglas.
Hello, hi. I was just wondering if you know what the proportion of the like out of all the traffic on King, what percentage is the are the violations? Like I know you're saying is every 9 seconds or so, but like let's say, or whatever it was, I forget the numbers. Let's say if it was 1,000 violations, are there like how many cars actually are traveling along King Street? Is it like 10,000 a day? So it's then 10%.
Oh, so what percent of the violations of all traffic volume?
Yes.
I'm from what I recall of the analysis, because most of the violations are both through and left turns, through traffic volumes and violations. So both at intersections where through is allowed and at intersections where through is not allowed, through traffic still has the highest volume. And so left has much less, but has more than right turns. So there are more left turns than there are right turns, for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions to this, but generally the violations are the majority of the volume.
Oh wow, really?
From what I can recall, because you're looking at what little traffic there is in the corridor, what little traffic there is supposed to be in the corridor.
Okay, thank you.
In the weeds these questions are. This is great. We'll do another couple of questions in the room before we're going back home.
Sorry. Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. What are the next steps for your research? What would you like to continue to explore, and or where do you think you'll take this after tonight, or now that you've published?
Personally, I didn't have a whole lot of thoughts on where this could go next, because I feel like it is highly dependent on what the city chooses to do, what Toronto Police chooses to do, and also what TDC decides to do, based off of all the things we've been hearing about the delays on the King streetcar. For me, this particular study is like the future. Like, it's like the question that you're asking is, what am I going to do with this in the future? Because I used to work in a co-op job for the city during the time of the King Street pilot. And so for me, this study is me coming full circle working on the King Street pilot.
Hi there. So your article talks about the role of potentially additional enforcement, better enforcement, automated enforcement. What do you think of the role of...
I can't really hear, it's chopping up.
Yeah, so your article talks about the role of, for example, automated enforcement, and of course, the implication is the actual manual enforcement could be better. What do you think of the role of infrastructure Like, for example, if you're a driver and you're new, you're from Mississauga, let's say, you're driving along King, you get to Bathurst, there's no signs in advance. You get there, there's a tiny sign that has like no through, bicycles and taxis accepted or whatever, or authorized vehicles accepted, and then taxis, blah, 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 time rate. And you're like, okay, so I guess I got to turn right. And you have to do all that in like a couple of seconds. You can kind of see why people might, even in lots of cases, accidentally be violating, because the infrastructure doesn't make it obvious. You have this like long confusing sign, and then you also have a green light still. So like, you know, when you're driving, you're like, green light means go. So do you think maybe the city should do infrastructure better first and then go back to the enforcement? Because at the moment, it seems like a lot of drivers could have a fairly valid excuse that they're confused.
Yeah, for sure. I understand where you're coming from with this concern. I do feel like the city has room to investigate and research other options for communicating the restrictions. Even in the beginning with the King Street pilot, it was very difficult for locals and out of town drivers to understand why are there new restrictions on King, and what are they, and why are they different for each intersection. Like I described earlier during the presentation, we have some intersections which still allow through movement but still don't allow left turns. So it's like, why is there this difference, and how do we communicate that? I think the city definitely should look into updating the infrastructure in some way in the corridor. As I previously described with some of those old center lanes that used to be the left turn lane, and that they were painted over with the crossed yellow-orange lines, like a lot of those have faded, and so like that can be updated. What are some ways that the city can make the corridor more clear in its intent? I do feel that in terms of enforcement, that's almost separate, as the Toronto Police Service is like a related and sub entity, but like they have their own mandate and such, and so I feel that there's definitely room for a two-pronged approach, if you will, for both improving infrastructure and also improving enforcement in the corridor.
I'll have a bunch more questions in the room. What I think is maybe we'll try doing rapid fire. So like we'll just take the questions, like really very short form questions. We'll take them all, and then we'll give Q a chance to sort of answer them all to the best of her ability, all in one go. So who had hands?
Keep your hands up until I touch you, please. Hi, I think you mentioned this earlier, but what was the goal of the traffic restrictions? Was it to increase throughput in the road?
The King Street pilot, and thus the King Street Transit Priority Corridor, was initially intended by the city to improve the streetcar times, I believe, because you used to be able to walk faster than the streetcar could go through the corridor. And by forcing cars to turn right off of King Street and not do the left turn or go through, because the left turn and the through was in the same lane as the streetcar tracks. And so by making the cars turn right, then they would be in a different lane and they would not block the streetcar.
Cool, thanks for that. I think we're actually out of time for questions. I'm sorry that my rapid fire experiment didn't work very well. So let's wrap it there. Thank you so much, Q, for your time today. Thank you everyone for your questions.